looks a bit gloomy out there.
If you've watched any of my previous reviews of point-and-click adventures, you'll know that I talk a lot about the writing in them. The quality of writing is, after all, at the heart of a good point-and-click, and so I try to give a vivid and detailed description of how it impacted me. However, after playing Jane Jensen's Grey Matter, I realized that my assessments have been relatively superficial thus far, and that there is a deeper, more fundamental dimension to good writing that Grey Matter opened my eyes to. You see, I usually talk a lot about the style of it. I question whether the tone fits, if the jokes are funny, or whether the themes are compelling. In Grey Matter, however, the strength of the writing lies more in substance and arguably less in style, although there is enough to be loved in the latter department as well. The dialogue, for example, may not always be particularly interesting, clever, or even natural sounding, but the main plot is such an intricately woven mystery, so full of interconnected and deeply relevant details that you eventually completely forget the writing even exists, let alone care about the style of it. This level of immersion and emotional connection is rare in video games, and I think it's worth taking a closer look at just how Grey Matter achieves it. First and foremost, the story and setting are actually very well researched. The game is set in Oxford, and the plot has several interesting ties to the actual history of the place and some famous people who live there. Many of the pre-rendered backgrounds are very closely modeled on real-life locations with just enough artistic license to convey this unsettling yet melancholic mood. There's also an honest sense of authenticity and even scientific accuracy that is seamlessly married with the fictional and more supernatural parts of the story. For example, one of the main characters is David, a neurobiologist who, after the tragic death of his wife, devotes himself to studying certain paranormal phenomena. What the game does particularly well with this character is that a basic understanding of his research methodologies doesn't just add flavor to the experience, but is actually an integral part of the puzzle solving. Now, I'm not going to pretend that either I, or Jane Jensen for that matter, have a PhD in neurobiology or information technology, but those are just two of the fields that the author drew clear inspiration from to give the mystery some real weight and a sense of credibility. Like I said, there's a richness and depth to the writing, which may occasionally falter in style, but is nevertheless very impressive in the way all its details come together to weave this tapestry of mystery. The other main character you play as is Samantha, a magician who takes a more cynical approach to investigating the strange happenings. However, she also employs her own craft in puzzle solving, which is to say she plays magic tricks on various people to get her way. But just like with David, you, the player, will have to become somewhat familiar with how the magic tricks actually work in order to successfully pull them off. I have to admit I was not a huge fan initially of a main character so openly comfortable with manipulation, but in time I got to learn her backstory, which allowed for some sympathy, and I also learned she does follow quite a clear code of conduct for magicians. Deception or illusion is obviously an inherent part of magic tricks, and in between the two main characters there is some subtle commentary on how solid the nature of reality actually is. Still, in both cases, the puzzle solving is often seamlessly married with the character's motivations and professional abilities. Speaking of characters, there are quite a lot more main characters than in your average video game story, and they are not just set dressings to deliver flavor text or punchlines. They have detailed backstories and unique motivations for their involvement in the events, and you, the player, constantly peel away more and more layers to their personality and backstory. The story is also very mature in that it deals with, well, actually mature themes, and it does so in a very compelling way. In addition to exploring topics such as love, grief, trauma adaptation, trust, and forgiveness, the game also asks interesting metaphysical questions about the nature of life and consciousness, and it treats these subjects with a degree of commitment to detail unseen in video game stories. They are not just casually mentioned in flavor text or symbolically represented through the art, but are fully explored through the main character's personal struggles. You get to experience and play out these struggles in pretty intimate detail, and the game doesn't ever come across as trying to directly send a message, but rather the story itself masterfully integrates these themes to create an engrossing, genuinely suspenseful, paranormal mystery. And at the end of the day, it's a story that can still be fully enjoyed even if you don't take the themes and philosophical meditations too seriously. I mentioned the art direction, and I feel it is especially important to talk about the soundtrack.
Wash it away if I could see the flowing water, nighttime light and dusty glow that bring the heat and fireflies. Oh, I'd run if your stare could find me, if you smirked, refused to share. Yes, I'd win you in that day. Too many places pull me away, just empty traces, nothing stays. What I'd give and what I'd trade.
To say that it's very fitting and memorable is frankly an understatement. The music was composed by Robert Holmes, who is Jane Jensen's husband, and the lead singer was their daughter. So it seems this game was largely a family project, and while I'm not going to speculate too much about what their relationship afforded them in creativity, I sincerely couldn't imagine something more complementary to the game and its writing than Robert's soundtrack. It is at times eerie or unsettling, reminding me of a David Lynch movie. At other times, it perfectly captures the heartbreak or relief of a particular turn of events. The main characters' themes are especially impactful, and they evoke this profound, haunting sense of sympathy with them. You understand and feel what David's life has become just by listening to the first few notes of his theme. The Daedalus Club theme, on the other hand, really punctuates an important turning point in the story, and you can really feel the tension of this grand but disturbing peak in your journey. Robert's music truly speaks to you things that Jane's words would take too long to express, and is essentially a non-verbal storyteller that is an integral part of the experience. So thus far, I've mostly gushed about the aspects I loved and ones that I believe are essential to an adventure game. I suppose I should also address whether there are any potential deal breakers and talk a little more about the gameplay itself. I've already briefly mentioned how the puzzle solving ties in beautifully with the story and characters, but how logical or difficult are the actual puzzles? They are mostly very sensible and not overly difficult, but the game does occasionally rely on somewhat obscure or nonsensical triggers to progress events. I'm talking about certain characters or actions becoming available only after you complete seemingly unrelated actions elsewhere, or about having to do certain things in a very particular but frankly counterintuitive order. I found Chapter 4 to be particularly confusing due to a couple of such issues, but overall I'm happy to say that the puzzle solving itself is exciting and well signposted. It is also massively helpful that the game tracks your completion of main and side objectives for each chapter, and the map itself will show you which locations still have unsolved puzzles, so you'll know where to spend your time and where not to waste it. I was also not very fond of how hotspots are highlighted with full text instead of a bright outline or something less obtrusive. I felt it was a shame to cover the beautiful pre-rendered backgrounds with a dozen or so lines of plain text, but then going through the game without the hotspot highlights meant potentially missing something important, so I sort of constantly toggled them on and off, which is of course also not great for immersion. Also, certain hotspots had fairly long descriptions, and these labels would occasionally overlap, causing them to display alternatingly, and I just wish a more elegant solution could have been implemented instead. Since I mentioned the backgrounds, I do want to say a few things about the graphics. They are a combination of static 3D backgrounds with real-time 3D characters, somewhat similar to the original Resident Evil games, but in higher definition. I found the indoor scenes to be generally more detailed, with better, more atmospheric lighting and varied color palettes, whereas a few of the outdoor scenes looked washed out or lacking in contrast and depth. But the biggest limitation you will notice is that these backgrounds are truly very static, with little to no animation. For example, even something as simple as opening your garage door isn't animated. The screen will simply turn dark, the audio of the door opening will play, and then you are shown the same screen with the door open. This way of handling transitions is quite common in the game, but surprisingly not all that immersion breaking. From an artistic standpoint, I have to praise the use of lighting and camera angles. Certain backgrounds are shown through these strange tilted camera angles that distort your perspective, giving an unreal or dreamlike quality to certain scenes. And while some locations are very down-to-earth and mundane, others are extremely surreal and imaginative, helping create this sense of tension and intrigue. And as much as I praise the music, I must also say that the voice acting sounds normal at best, meaning you don't generally notice it, so it doesn't usually break immersion. However, there are also some truly silly moments that make you wonder whether they ran out of time in recording some of these lines. Still, much like the writing of the dialogue, its delivery was also something that I eventually stopped noticing as I gradually got more invested in the story. And so this brings us back to my initial points about the game's strengths. Grey Matter definitely shows its budget constraints around the edges, but it hits hard where it matters most. It delivers a heavily dramatic and suspenseful plot, and it incorporates a great deal of well-researched, mature subject matters that are also relevant to the gameplay. The art direction is overall fantastic, and the soundtrack especially is hauntingly beautiful. If you are a fan of Jane Jensen's work, or of adventure games in general, it goes without saying that this game is a must. I really think it's a shame for both the devs and fans that this game didn't get more attention. It is not merely an obscure, underrated gem, but one that is frankly in the running for best adventure game of all time.
I've heard rumors about Dr. Styles. Students say people have disappeared.